Uh, Bam, we're ready to rock and roll. Foster, it's on you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I don't know how many of you had a day like I did. I left work saying I'm going to go home and cry now. No, it was just it was just that kind of a busy day, stressful. Like from the moment I walked in the door, it, people were almost lined up at my office door, like we need this, we need this, we need this, and it just didn't stop all day. So thank you for being here. I love being here. Um, it is renewing and encouraging to me to see you all here. Even if I'm the one talking, if I'm the one teaching tonight, the blessing. I get the blessing out of this, in a way that perhaps you'll never know. So let's get into this. Pastor Allen asked me a few weeks ago about speaking about hidden figures. And at first I'm thinking, okay, I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Hidden Figures. I have not. It's probably something I should watch because I hear it's very, very good. When it comes to mind, I think of, wearing big baggy clothes so it hides your figure, but that's not what we're talking about. We are talking about people that don't immediately come to mind when you think of something else. When you, so my first question here for everybody is, do any of you, sorry, before I get to that question, he gave me a list of about 4 or 5 people that I could speak about. And the first few names, I actually knew those names. And the one I'm going to talk about tonight, I had heard the name. It was sitting in the back of my mind, like, boy, I know this name. And I had to think for a while before it came to mind where I knew this person from. And it took a little bit. And I'm like, boy, I think they're from here. And then I had to look it up. And then I had to look it up because it's not a name that jumps out at you anywhere else in the rest of the Bible. So my question is, have any of you heard the name Caleb? Do any of you know where that name comes, where that name, not the history of the name, but where that person comes in the Bible? You can unmute and answer, or you can put it in the chat if you know. Um, does anyone know where Caleb comes from? Well, I'll give you.
Caleb is Caleb one of hold on. I'll say is that Joshua, one of Joshua homies?
Yes, thank you. There you go. I don't know who said that, but well done. That's exactly right. He, he was one of the spies. And we all remember Joshua. Why? Because Damien said, I thought I recognized the voice, but I just couldn't see who said that. Um, but we all know Joshua because he went on to lead the nation of Israel after Moses died. He led them into the promised land. There's an entire book named after Joshua. Caleb was one of the 12 spies, but he's not known very well. What sets him apart from the other 10 spies, so there were 12, we know Joshua, he was one of the other two that said, let's do this. So yes, he was one of the 12 spies that Moses had sent out. So before we get more into what sets him apart, let's give a little background for this right now. Israel has come out of Egypt. God God sent 12 plagues, right? 12 plagues? Even that I could have wrong. But sent a bunch of plagues, frogs, locusts, boils, all of these things, turned the water to blood. The last plague being the most devastating, right? The firstborn son of every house was killed. But Israel was spared from that. Right? From each of those things, God spared them. God brought them to the Red Sea. He parted the Red Sea, let them cross, and then he crushed the Egyptian army by letting the waters come back over top of them, right? And he delivered them not only from Egypt, but delivered them from being brought back to Egypt into slavery. He brought them out of that slavery. They've been wandering in the desert. Anyone know for how long they've been in the desert right now? It's actually only been a couple of weeks, probably, maybe months, right? God took them, gave them the 10 commandments. Moses went up the mountain, got the 10 commandments, came back down. Um, God has fed them, sent them manna. He sent them quail to feed them. Time and again, the Israelites complained and God came through for them. And just a little more background, they even saw, right, God has led them as a cloud during the day and a pillar of fire by night. Um, they even saw, after they were complaining about all of these things, one of the last things we read before we read about Caleb is that they were complaining again, and God burned the outskirts of their camp, burned people until Moses interceded for them, and then God spared them from more fire. And this is because of their complaining. Then steps in, then we get to this part where now God has brought them to the edge of the promised land. They're not in it yet, but God has brought them there. And he commands Moses to send out 12 spies, one leader. One leader from each tribe is to go into the promised land. They're to spy it out, see about the people, see about the land itself, how fertile it is, how much water there is, all of these kinds of things to prepare the people to go in and conquer it. And these spies are supposed to report back, right? And so that's what they do. 12 of them go up as a group, and then possibly separately. We don't get told how they spy it out, but we're told that they do, and they see that this land is rich. It's bountiful. There's food, there's water, there's everything they would want as a nation is there. Space for them. And these spies, in scripture says they cut down. They went in during the time that the first harvest would be, right? So the first fruits were starting to become available in the land. So they're seeing how rich this is. And it says that the spies cut down one cluster of grapes, but it had to be carried on a pole between two men. So that's how big this cluster of grapes are, is that it had to be carried on a pole. So this land is rich, and it says it was flowing in milk and honey. If any of you have seen VeggieTales, in the words of Larry, the cucumber, it sounds sticky. But that's what the scripture describes this land as, flowing in milk and honey, meaning it's rich. It's going to feed them, nurture them. They can grow as a nation there. And these 12 spies come back and they report. 10 of them. So all 12 of them agree that this land is rich. It's bountiful. It's plentiful. It's going to feed us. 10 of them then go on and say, but the people are tall, they're giants, they're many, we can't defeat them. And they offer this spirit of defeat before they even start. But two of them report and say, God said he's going to give it to us, let's go get it. Right? And so in their words, so in Numbers chapter 13 and chapter 14 is where we find Caleb. Caleb only gets 5 mentions in those 2 chapters, and he's never mentioned again throughout Scripture. The second time we see Caleb mentioned is in Numbers 13, verse gotta say 30. Sorry, y'all. These progressives aren't working for me at the moment. But Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. So the people are complaining and grumbling and saying, we can't do it. And these 10 people have convinced hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, that they can't do it. And the people agreed and start complaining and saying, we were better off in Egypt. Why aren't we back there? But Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. Let's go at once to take the land, he said. We can certainly conquer it. And it says it in an exclamation point. He was excited. He knew God promised this. Let's go. Let's go get it. I see him, you know, standing on the other side of on the far side of the promised land, not even going in and pointing at it and saying, it is rich, it is ours for the taking. We need to go get it. God said he's going to give it to us. Let's go. Joshua was the other spy that agreed with him. And the two of them together said, yes, let's go get it. The people grumbled and complained. And they complained about it so much, they became afraid and they wanted to even stone Caleb. This is the fourth time we see Caleb mentioned. Um, uh, but the whole, in Numbers 14, chapter number 10, but the whole community began to talk about stoning Joshua and Caleb. The people became so afraid of going and taking what God had promised them that they were ready to silence the people who were saying, let's go do it. Not just silence them, but kill them in order to silence them. Um, sorry, I'm drawing a blank. I have to turn the page on my own notes of so I see what else I have going on there. Um, so what do we know about Caleb? We'll get to the last mention of Caleb as part of the lessons we learn about him. What do we see then about Caleb? Caleb is a man of faith. He's a man of obedience. He was able to look back at the past and saw what God had done and knew he would do it again. He said, God has delivered us already. God has provided for us. He is telling us this land is for us. Let's go get it. He was ready to step out and lead hundreds of thousands of people across whatever. I don't know if they were across the Jordan at that point or not. Eventually they did cross the Jordan. He was willing to step out in faith and say, I don't know how we're going to conquer it. There's more people in the land than there are us, but we're going to go do it because God said do it. So we knew he was a man of faith. He believed God's promises. The promises that God had spoken to Abraham, that he had spoken to Moses. He heard them, saw them, believed them, and wanted to step out in faith. We know that he was a man of truth. He spoke the truth. He said, yes, it's a land of bounty. Yes, there's people, they're strong, but yes, God has said, do it, and let's do it. So he spoke the truth. So he's a man of obedience. He's a man of faith. He's a man of truth. We also know that he was a leader. He was already a leader. He was the leader of the tribe of Judah. One of the first verses in one of the earlier verses in chapter 13, it identifies what tribe every one of those 12 spies was from. Caleb was from the tribe of Judah. And we're going to see, or I'm going to point out a little bit later in a few minutes, how him stepping out benefited an entire tribe. Um, we also know about him that God calls him in chapter 14. The last time we see his name is as God is talking to Moses. And he says in verses 23 and 24, but they will never even see the land I swore to give their ancestors. None of those who have treated me with contempt will ever see it. But my servant Caleb has a different attitude than the others. He has remained loyal to me, so I will bring him into the land he explored. His descendants will possess their full share of that land. And then at the end of chapter 14, we see now turn around and don't go on toward the land where the Amalekites and Canaanites live. Tomorrow you must set out for the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea. Caleb was called, God said of him, my servant. So we knew that God even viewed his obedience, his faithfulness, as as God called him. I mean, it says right there, God called him my servant. And the verses talk about how he rewarded that the punishment for the 10 other spies, and the people's response to those spies and willingness to believe them and not obey God, because at this point God has commanded them to go into the promised land and conquer it. He didn't just say, if you want this, go get it. He told them to go get it. And so the hundreds of thousands of people who had lived through the plagues of Egypt, lived through the Red Sea, lived through the wilderness, and God providing for them in the wilderness, were ready to turn their backs on God and disobey him. All because 10 people said we should be afraid of the people in that land. Those 10 didn't have faith, but Caleb did, and Joshua did. And God said of Caleb, my servant Caleb will see the promised land. So some of the lessons that I've been thinking about this for weeks now, and it today, even coming home after a rough day at work, I'm sitting there in the rain at the bus stop going, okay, what am I going to, not just what am I going to say about it? I've been thinking about this for a while, but started to get excited and had to get home and write thoughts down on the paper. And so I started thinking about some of the lessons. One of the first lessons we see from this, number one, God's grace in the past is his promise of more grace, greater grace to come. And Caleb believed this and obeyed. One of the lessons, God's grace in the past is his promise of more and greater grace to come. All of these things that God did and delivered Israel from in Egypt just pointed to more that he wanted to do for them in the promised land. He wanted to take them from a place of hunger, of slavery, of death and destruction into a region where he wanted them to flourish and prosper and be full and fed and nourished. And Caleb believed that promise and wanted to obey. He took that to heart, that God, the blessings God had showed them in the past, he was going to do more of that in the future. That tells us that in our own lives, to examine our own lives and look at what God has done in the past, but not to dwell there, to know that those blessings that God has already given us are just a taste of what he wants to do in the future. He promises this over and over and over again, that his blessings are more to come. Thank you. I think, see, blessings of a very good wife that you could see I needed some water there. Um, and those, we got that interrupted my train of thought for a second. We need to reflect on our past and see those things. And it's good to reflect on that past, see where we've come from, but to know that God has more for us in the future. And especially when he says, go, he's got more grace, more blessing lined up for us. and we need to go. That brings us to lesson 2. Obedience and faith will not always be popular. They will come at a cost. Many will not understand. You may be persecuted for them. Caleb saw those blessings, and while he was speaking the truth, he was speaking with excitement, saying, God has promised this. Let's go get it. It wasn't received. It wasn't popular. Some people, hundreds of thousands of people wanted to stone him, and yet he still spoke it. He still lived it. He still believed it. He still believed God, and he wanted them to go after it. So in our own lives, not always will obedience and our faith be popular. Our own families may not agree with it. Our own families may not believe it. Our own families may tell us to turn back from it, to turn away. But we need to remember God has blessed us in the past. He's promised to bless us in the future. Don't turn back. Disobedience is more costly than that obedience. The Israelites disobeyed. They did not go out and take the promised land, and it cost them 40 years of wandering in the desert. 40 years on this side of the promised land when they could see it. They could see the promised land right over there. They saw the bounty of it. They knew it. They heard the report of 10, 12 people that said this is where to go, and they disobeyed, and it cost them more than their obedience ever would have. That's a tough thing to do, right? Turning when all of the people around you, your friends, your family are saying, we see that example with Job, his own friends saying, just curse God and die. Our own family may tell us to turn our backs on God. But in God's words to his servant about his servant, my servant, God rewards that faith. God rewards that obedience. He blesses that faith and obedience. And that's my third point. God will reward your faith and obedience. Even if, and in Caleb's example, I've got here, even if the people and history do not, right? History doesn't record Caleb. That's the last verse we ever see about Caleb, is that God says, but my servant Caleb has a different attitude. But Caleb was still blessed. Something to remember. The people wandered in the desert for 40 years because God wanted to make sure the elderly came with them and all of the adults. So anybody, I believe it doesn't record it quite this way, but if I remember from my own learning from years back, basically God wanted 2 generations of the Israelites to die in the wilderness, and their children are what God then said, now I'm going to lead you into the promised land. He wanted, but Caleb and Joshua were rewarded for their faith and obedience by being able to enter the promised land and see it and taste it and benefit from it. From what I understand, they were the only two. Moses didn't get to enter the promised land, right? Moses, for his own disobedience to God, was not allowed to enter that promised land. Another benefit of that faith and obedience that God rewards. Caleb's tribe, Judah, he was a leader to that. So what we can infer from Caleb being a leader to this tribe and what God does later for the tribe is that God benefited the entire tribe, that it was counted to them as faithfulness. How we can see this, and I had to look this up and find out, because I kind of remembered this. We know that later on, after Israel rebels and it's split into 2 nations, Judah became one of the nations. And we know from that line that it lasted longer than the kingdom of Israel, right? It stuck around longer than them. It had more kings that were faithful to God and obeyed God than Israel did. And each step of that way, we see that God, that starting, so this is an example of sort of the opposite side of the coin of God says that the sins of the father will follow, but so do obedience and faith. And we see that even more, that obedience and faith last for generations. The blessings continue for generation after generation after generation, for what ended up being thousands of years. Israel lasted as a nation for thousands of years, and God continued to bless that. Even after he split the kingdoms, Judah continued to follow that example of obedience, faith, and they saw the blessings for it. Now, eventually, yes, they too were conquered because they turned their back on God, and we see the consequences of that. But I truly believe that because of Caleb's leadership at that point in history, that the blessings continued to flow out to Judah as a tribe because of this one man who said, yes, let's do it. And so for us, our own obedience, our own faith carries on for generation after generation, example after example. And so to me, that's kind of intimidating, actually. That But even more is the cost of disobedience, is to not be faithful. I know that the cost to my wife and my son will be far greater than whatever the personal cost to me right now of my faith and obedience. And so we see that Caleb had that same thing. But then history never mentions him again. Not again. There are 12 other people that history records and became the pillars of the church. 12 disciples, and history remembers almost all of them. Um, there are a few disciples that aren't talked about very much after Scripture. One that never got mentioned again. But we see that where was I going with that? I kind of lost my train of thought there. But we um, yeah, I, I can't even really talk anymore about how in just five verses, five mentions of his name, we see a life of faith. We see a life of obedience, and we see the blessings and grace that God bestowed upon not only him, but his entire family and his entire tribe because of that. And that's why, while he just, I know the premise of the movie, Hidden Figures. It's all about the program for NASA and the people behind it, and it became this great thing. We know that because of the faithfulness of Caleb and Joshua, that God then continued to bless the nation of Israel and eventually fulfilled his promise through them and because of them into the promised land. For us, that should be encouragement to us to recognize as the blessings God has bestowed on us in the past, and it should spur us on to greater faith and greater obedience now and in the future. One of the things I'm afraid of is counting myself out of what God has for me in the future because of disobedience and lack of faith now. I don't want that. We see how that happened. That led to the 10 other spies. Their lack of faith and their disobedience caused an entire nation to have to suffer for 40 years in the desert. I don't want that. I don't want that for me. I don't want that for the generations that come after me. As a family, as a church family, I don't want that for us. I want us as a family, as a church, to thrive because of faith and obedience in God. I don't know if that took 30 minutes, but that's all I've got.